He banished her to a ruined castle. She turned it into a kingdom, the Scottish borders, 1814. There is a particular kind of exile that is meant, by the person who orders it, to be a punishment so complete that the exiled person simply disappears, not merely from the household but from consequence itself, sent somewhere remote and forgotten, and left there to wither quietly, out of sight and out of mind, while the person who banished her returns to the comfortable business of forgetting she ever existed. This is the story of what happens when the exile does not go according to plan, when the woman sent away to disappear instead builds, in the ruins of her banishment, something so extraordinary that the disappearing itself becomes the thing that cannot be forgotten. This is the story of Eleanor Ashby, Duchess of Kilmarrow, and of Ravensgate Castle, and of the year her husband spent believing he had erased her, only to discover that he had done nothing of the kind. Eleanor had married William Sinclair, the 8th Duke of Kilmarrow, in the spring of 1812, in a match that had been arranged between their two families for reasons that were, on the surface, entirely conventional. The joining of the Sinclair estates in the Scottish borders with the considerable Ashby fortune from the south, a union that satisfied every practical requirement two respectable families might bring to a marriage negotiation. What neither family had accounted for in the arranging of it was the particular and formidable character of the Dowager Duchess of Kilmarrow, William's mother, a woman named Constance, whose grip on her son's household and her son's judgment had, over the years since her husband's death, become so complete that William himself scarcely recognized the extent to which his own decisions were, in fact his mother's decisions, delivered through him with his own voice and his own signature. Constance had not wanted Eleanor for her son. She had wanted, for reasons rooted in old grievances and older ambitions that predated William's birth, a match with the Fairweather family of Northumberland, whose lands bordered Kilmarrow's own, and whose alliance, Constance had believed for 20 years, would finally settle a boundary dispute that had simmered between the two families for 3 generations. William's marriage to Eleanor had disrupted this ambition entirely, and Constance, though she had been unable to prevent the match itself, had never once abandoned her determination to undo it. She began her campaign almost immediately, employing the same patient and deniable cruelty that women of her particular temperament perfect over decades of practice. Small comments dropped into conversation, selective silences deployed at precisely calculated moments, the careful cultivation of doubts that never announced themselves as doubts but simply accumulated, drop by drop, in the mind of a son who had never once had cause to question his mother's account of anything. By the 2nd year of the marriage, Constance had constructed, through months of patient suggestion, an entire narrative around Eleanor that bore almost no relationship to the truth of who Eleanor actually was, a narrative of extravagance and disloyalty and secret discontent that existed nowhere except in the careful arrangement of Constance's selective observations, but that had, through sheer patient repetition, begun to reshape William's understanding of his own wife. The final catalyst arrived in the winter of 1814, when Eleanor, following a difficult miscarriage that had left her weakened and deeply grieving, was accused by Constance, in a private conversation with William, that Eleanor never knew had taken place until it was far too late to defend herself against it, of having deliberately concealed the pregnancy's difficulties from her husband, of having consulted, in secret, a physician of questionable reputation whose advice Constance suggested, with careful and devastating ambiguity, may have contributed to the loss of the child, and of harboring, beneath her grief, a coldness toward William and toward Kilmarrow itself, that Constance framed as evidence of a wife who had never truly wanted this marriage and had, perhaps, engineered the loss of the child rather than bear an heir to a house she secretly resented. Every element of this narrative was false, but it was constructed, as Constance constructed everything, from fragments of truth arranged into a devastating lie. Eleanor had indeed consulted a physician outside the family's usual circle, but only because the family physician had been unavailable during a sudden crisis, and the alternative had, in fact, saved Eleanor's own life, at considerable risk to his professional reputation for treating a duchess without proper authorization. Eleanor had indeed grown quiet and withdrawn following the loss, but from grief so complete, she could scarcely speak of it, not from any coldness toward the husband she had genuinely loved. William, exhausted by grief of his own, and vulnerable, in his own mourning, to his mother's careful and patient poison, in a way he might have resisted under ordinary circumstances, believed her. He came to Eleanor's chambers on a cold February night, still weak from her own recovery, and delivered, in a voice she scarcely recognized as her husband's, the sentence that would define the following year of her life. "I know what you did," he said, his voice shaking with a grief and a fury that Eleanor understood, with growing horror, was directed entirely at her. "My mother has told me everything. The physician, the secrecy. I do not know if you meant to lose the child or simply did not care enough to protect him properly, but I cannot look at you, Eleanor, without seeing the death of my son in your face." Eleanor, still weak, still grieving a loss that had nearly cost her own life, tried desperately to explain the true circumstances of the physician's involvement, the depth and reality of her own grief, the complete absence of any coldness toward a marriage and a husband she had genuinely and deeply loved since the earliest months of their union. But William, primed by his mother's months of careful construction and blinded by his own grief into a state where reason had entirely abandoned him, heard none of it as truth. "You will leave Kilmarrow Hall," he said. "I cannot have you here, among the household, poisoning everything you touch with whatever coldness allowed this to happen. There is a property in the borders, Ravensgate Castle, part of the original Sinclair holdings, unoccupied for the better part of 30 years. You will go there. You will remain there until I have determined what is to be done about the future of this marriage, if indeed there is to be a future at all." Eleanor was sent to Ravensgate within the week, still recovering, still grieving, still entirely unable to comprehend the completeness of what had happened to her, escorted by a small retinue of servants who had been instructed, she would later learn, to provide for her basic needs and nothing beyond them, and left, in the cold grey dawn of a Scottish February, at the gates of a castle that had not been properly inhabited since before William's own birth. Ravensgate Castle, when Eleanor's carriage finally reached it after a journey of nearly 2 full days over increasingly rough and remote roads, presented a spectacle that might have broken the spirit of a lesser woman entirely. It rose from a windswept headland above a grey and churning sea, its towers half crumbled, its great hall open in places to the sky where the roof had long ago collapsed, its grounds so thoroughly overgrown that the original gardens had disappeared entirely beneath decades of unchecked wilderness. The few habitable rooms that remained were damp and cold and stripped of most of their original furnishings, the whole structure carrying the particular melancholy of a place that had once been magnificent and had been, for 30 years, simply and thoroughly forgotten. Eleanor stood before the ruined gates on that cold February morning, weak from illness and grief and the long, punishing journey, and felt, for the first time since William's terrible accusation, something shift within her that was not despair. She had spent 2 years being managed. She had spent 2 years watching, with a growing and unexamined unease she had never quite been able to name, as her husband's mother arranged small circumstances around her with a patience Eleanor had sensed but never fully understood the purpose of. She had spent the darkest weeks of her life grieving a lost child while being systematically stripped, through lies she had not been present to defend herself against, of the marriage and the home and the husband she had genuinely loved. She had arrived at the gates of a ruined castle expecting, if she was honest with herself, that this was where her story would simply end, a slow and forgotten deterioration in a crumbling building at the edge of the world, exactly as William's mother had, in some careful and unspoken corner of her ambitions, undoubtedly intended. Eleanor Ashby was not, however, a woman who had ever been particularly good at simply ending where other people intended her to end, she thought, standing before the broken gates, of her own father, a man of considerable business acumen who had built the Ashby fortune from a single modest shipping concern into one of the most significant merchant enterprises in southern England, through decades of patient, practical, unglamorous work that he had never once been ashamed of, despite the aristocratic circles his success eventually allowed his daughter to marry into. She thought of the summers of her childhood spent, unusually for a young woman of her eventual station, learning at her father's side the practical mechanics of building something from very little, the management of accounts, the negotiation of contracts, the patient accumulation of small improvements that, compounded over years, produced genuine and lasting transformation. She looked at the ruined castle before her, and she thought, "This is mine now, whatever else has been taken from me." And she began, within the first week of her arrival, before she had even fully recovered her physical strength, to make it so. The small retinue of servants sent with her, a lady's maid named Bridget, an elderly groundsman named Fergus, who had some ancestral connection to the Ravensgate property, predating even the Sinclair family's ownership of it, and 2 young footmen, who had drawn the unfortunate lot of accompanying the banished Duchess to her exile, found themselves, within the first month, organized by Eleanor into something considerably more purposeful than the small and forgotten household they had expected to become. She began with the habitable rooms, cleaning and restoring what could be restored with the limited resources available, and writing, in the same first weeks, a series of careful letters to her father in England. Not letters of despair, though she permitted herself, in the privacy of her own grief, considerable and genuine despair in those early nights, but letters of practical request, drawing on the independent portion of her own fortune that her father had, with the same foresight that had built his own business, insisted be settled on Eleanor separately at the time of her marriage, protected from her husband's direct control under the particular terms of the marriage settlement. Her father, receiving his daughter's letters and understanding immediately, from the careful and specific practicality of her requests, that something had gone very seriously wrong at Kilmarrow, responded not with the alarm Eleanor had feared, but with the same steady support he had shown her throughout her childhood. Funds released promptly, along with a letter that Eleanor kept, for the rest of her life, folded in a small box beside her bed. Whatever has happened, I have never once doubted your character, and I do not intend to begin now. Build whatever you need to build. I am proud of you already. With her father's support and her own considerable and long-dormant practical intelligence, Eleanor began the restoration of Ravensgate Castle in earnest. She hired local labourers from the surrounding villages, men and women who had, for 30 years, watched the castle sit empty and crumbling above their community, and who received, with genuine and growing enthusiasm, the news that the new Duchess intended not merely to inhabit a few salvageable rooms, but to properly restore the entire structure to something resembling its former significance. She brought in a master mason from Edinburgh to assess and begin repairing the collapsed sections of the Great Hall's roof. She commissioned local weavers, whose traditional craft had been declining for want of significant patronage in the region, to produce tapestries and furnishings for the restored rooms, providing a source of income and renewed purpose to craftspeople who had watched their traditional skills grow increasingly marginal in a changing economy. And she began, drawing on skills she had learned at her father's side and had never once expected to apply to anything beyond the management of a household budget, to think about Ravensgate not merely as a residence to be restored, but as an enterprise to be built. The castle's position, on its wind-swept headland above the sea, commanded views and a dramatic natural beauty that Eleanor recognized, with the same clear-eyed practicality her father had instilled in her, as a genuine asset rather than merely a picturesque backdrop to her exile. She began, within the first year, cultivating relationships with the region's other landed families, not from any social ambition, but from the same patient, practical instinct for building relationships that would serve a larger purpose, which had governed every decision of her father's own successful career. By the autumn of 1814, 8 months after her banishment, word had begun to spread through the Scottish borders of the remarkable transformation occurring at Ravensgate Castle, a transformation that had, by this point, become considerably more significant than simple restoration. Eleanor had established, on the castle's extensive and now properly cultivated grounds, a working estate that combined traditional agriculture with several more innovative enterprises, a weaving works that had grown, from her initial small commissions to local craftspeople, into a genuine and increasingly reputable manufactory, producing textiles that were beginning to attract interest from merchants as far away as Edinburgh and Glasgow. An ambitious program of land improvement, drawing on modern agricultural methods that Eleanor had studied through correspondence with agricultural societies in England, which had begun to produce yields from Ravensgate's long-neglected farmland that exceeded anything the surrounding region had seen in decades. And, perhaps most remarkably, the beginnings of what would become, within another 2 years, one of the most celebrated gardens in the Scottish borders, an ambitious restoration of the castle's original grounds, informed by Eleanor's own careful study and considerable natural talent for horticultural design, that drew, even in its early stages, visitors curious to see what the banished Duchess had built from 30 years of ruin. She did not build any of this to spite William, though she would not have claimed, if asked honestly, that some portion of the satisfaction she took in the growing success of Ravensgate was entirely free of the particular sweetness that comes from thriving in circumstances someone else intended as your destruction. She built it, primarily, because building it was the only thing that made the unbearable grief of her situation bearable. The loss of her child, the loss of the husband she had genuinely loved, the loss of the home and the position and the entire life she had believed herself settled into. She built it because her father had taught her, across a childhood most young women of her class never received, that the antidote to despair was rarely comfort and was very often simply work, patient, practical, purposeful work that produced, over time, something real enough to stand against whatever had tried to destroy you. The local community, initially curious and then increasingly and genuinely devoted to the Duchess, who had arrived among them broken and had chosen, instead of quietly disappearing as everyone had expected, to build something extraordinary in their midst, began to speak of Eleanor with a warmth and a respect that had nothing to do with her title and everything to do with what she had actually accomplished. Fergus, the elderly groundsman, told anyone who would listen that he had served the Sinclair family his entire life and had never once, in that entire life, witnessed anything at Ravensgate to compare with what the young Duchess had built in less than a year. Bridget, Eleanor's lady's maid, who had arrived at Ravensgate expecting a slow and melancholy decline into obscurity alongside her mistress, found herself instead managing a household staff that had grown, within a year, from 4 servants to nearly 40, all of them employed by an enterprise that had transformed a ruin into something approaching a small and thriving kingdom of its own. Eleanor thought, some evenings, standing on the restored ramparts of Ravensgate Castle and looking out over the gardens and the working fields and the sea beyond, of the woman she had been before her banishment, gentle, trusting, entirely unprepared for the possibility that the people closest to her might be capable of the particular cruelty that had been visited upon her. She did not entirely recognize that woman anymore, and she found, examining the difference with the same clear-eyed honesty she brought to everything, that she did not entirely regret the change, however devastating the process that had produced it. William, at Kilmarrow Hall, spent the year following Eleanor's banishment in a state that his mother, watching him with growing and unacknowledged concern, would eventually be forced to recognize as something considerably more troubled than the simple relief she had expected her son to feel at the removal of an unworthy wife. He did not remarry, despite Constance's careful and increasingly urgent renewal of her old ambitions regarding the Fairweather alliance. He found himself, in the months following Eleanor's departure, unable to summon any genuine interest in the various eligible women his mother continued, with mounting frustration, to present to him. He grew increasingly withdrawn, spending long hours alone in his study, and developed, over the course of the year, a sleeplessness that no physician's remedy seemed able to touch. He told himself, in the early months, that this was simply the natural residue of grief. Grief for the lost child, grief for a marriage that had ended in what he still believed, based entirely on his mother's careful construction of events, to have been a genuine betrayal. But as the months accumulated, and the sharp edges of his initial fury began, inevitably, to soften into something quieter and more reflective, William found himself, with increasing frequency, returning to specific memories of his marriage that did not fit comfortably within the narrative his mother had constructed for him. He remembered Eleanor's genuine and evident joy upon learning of her pregnancy, a joy that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the secret coldness his mother had described. He remembered the particular and specific tenderness with which Eleanor had always spoken of the child she was carrying, the small preparations she had begun making, entirely unprompted, for a nursery she had clearly and genuinely anticipated with love. He remembered, with a growing and uncomfortable clarity, the physician his mother had described with such damning ambiguity, and began, for the first time, to actually investigate rather than simply accept his mother's account, writing eventually to the physician himself, a Dr. Alistair Munro, whose response, when it finally arrived, described in careful and entirely credible medical detail the genuine crisis that had necessitated his emergency involvement, and the very real risk, to Eleanor's own life, that his intervention had, in fact, prevented, at some professional cost to himself, for treating a duchess without the usual formal authorization from her husband's household. William read Dr. Munro's letter multiple times in the quiet of his study, and felt something in his understanding of the previous year begin, slowly and with mounting horror, to reorganize itself around a truth he had refused, for 8 months, to properly examine. He began, in the autumn of 1814, to make his own careful and increasingly systematic inquiries, questioning household staff who had been present during the difficult weeks of Eleanor's miscarriage, and who revealed, under his direct and finally genuinely curious questioning, details that contradicted, in small but accumulating ways, everything his mother had told him. A housemaid who recalled Eleanor's genuine and desperate grief in the days following the loss, weeping alone for hours in a manner entirely inconsistent with the cold indifference his mother had described. A footman who remembered his mother's specific and repeated instructions to observe and report on Eleanor's private conversations and correspondence in the weeks before the banishment. Instructions that had never, William now understood with sickening clarity, been given for any reason he had been told at the time. He confronted his mother in November, armed with Dr. Munro's letter and the accumulated testimony of a household staff who had, once William began genuinely asking, rather than simply accepting, proven remarkably willing to speak the truth they had been quietly and uncomfortably carrying for months. Constance, faced at last with evidence too substantial to talk her way around, did not confess so much as she retreated into the same cold and unrepentant justification that women of her particular temperament always eventually retreat into when their careful constructions finally collapse. "I did what was necessary to protect this family's future," she said. "The Fairweather alliance would have secured Kilmarrow for generations. Eleanor was never—" "Eleanor," William said, and his voice, when it came, carried a coldness his mother had genuinely never heard from him before, "was my wife. She was carrying my child. And you destroyed both, with lies constructed for the sake of an ambition I never once shared and would never have permitted, had I understood what you were actually doing." He stood. "I want you to understand, clearly and completely, that I know now what you did, and I am going to spend whatever remains of my life trying to undo it, however impossible that may prove to be." William travelled to Ravensgate Castle in December of 1814, 10 months after Eleanor's banishment, driven by a mounting and desperate urgency to reach the wife he had wronged so completely, and arrived, after 2 days of hard travel over increasingly familiar border roads, at a castle he scarcely recognized from the descriptions he carried in his memory of a ruin 30 years abandoned. The gates, which he remembered as broken and rusted, stood restored and freshly painted, flanked by neat stone walls that had clearly been rebuilt with considerable care and expense. The grounds beyond, which he remembered as an overgrown wilderness, had been transformed into gardens of genuine and celebrated beauty, even in the bare stillness of a border winter, structured with a horticultural sophistication that spoke of real expertise rather than simple maintenance. The castle itself, whose towers he remembered as half-crumbled, and whose great hall had been opened to the sky, rose before him whole and restored, its stonework repaired, its roofline complete, smoke rising from chimneys that had stood cold for 30 years, the whole structure carrying an air of purposeful and thriving activity that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the forgotten ruin he had sent his wife to disappear into. He stood before the gates in a state of genuine and profound disorientation, and was met, within minutes of his arrival being announced, not by a broken and desperate woman grateful for rescue, but by a groundsman, Fergus, though William did not yet know his name, who regarded the Duke with an expression of careful and unhurried assessment, before informing him that Her Grace was currently occupied with the estate's steward, reviewing the quarter's accounts, and would receive him when that business was concluded. William waited, in a restored and elegant sitting room he did not recognize as belonging to any castle he had ever visited, for the better part of an hour, and felt, in the waiting, the particular and unfamiliar experience of a man discovering that his own arrival was no longer the most urgent business of the day for the person he had come to see. Eleanor came to him, finally, dressed simply but with an unmistakable authority in her bearing that had not existed, William understood immediately, in the gentle and trusting young woman he had banished 10 months before. She looked at him with an expression that contained neither the desperate hope for reconciliation he had, in some fearful corner of himself, half expected, nor the bitter fury he had also braced for, but something more composed and more devastating than either, the calm, assessing look of a woman who had built, in the wreckage of her banishment, an entire life she was not entirely certain she wished to disrupt. "William," she said. "I know the truth," he said, before she could say anything further, the words spilling out of him with the accumulated urgency of 10 months of dawning horror. "I know what my mother did. The physician, the lies about the miscarriage, the household staff instructed to spy on you, all of it. I have confronted her. I have removed her from any influence at Kilmarrow, I have come to beg your forgiveness and to ask you to come home." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, in the restored sitting room of the castle she had built from 30 years of ruin, and felt the full and complicated weight of everything he was asking. "I believe that you were deceived," she said slowly. "I believe, seeing you now, that the man who sent me here was a man genuinely and thoroughly manipulated by someone he had every reason to trust. I do not hate you for having been deceived, William. I understand, better than I would like to, exactly how patiently and how completely a determined enough liar can reshape what a person believes." She paused, and her eyes, when she continued, held both genuine feeling and a hard clarity that had not existed in the young bride he had sent away. "But you did not simply believe a lie. You looked at the woman who had loved you honestly, who was still weak and grieving from nearly losing her own life, and you chose to believe your mother's account over my desperate truth, without once asking me the questions that might have unraveled the whole deception in a single conversation. That is not a wound that simply closes because the lie has finally been exposed." "I know," William said. "I know I have no right to ask this of you. I am asking it anyway, because the alternative, living the rest of my life without attempting to make right what I allowed to happen, is not something I find I am able to accept." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, looking at her husband in the sitting room of the castle that had become, over 10 extraordinary months, considerably more than a place of exile. "Come and see what I have built," she said finally. "Before we speak of what comes next, I think you should understand, fully, exactly what you sent me away to build, before either of us decides anything about what happens now." She walked him through Ravensgate over the following 2 days, the restored Great Hall with its rebuilt roof and its new tapestries, woven by local craftspeople whose traditional livelihoods Eleanor's patronage had revived. The working fields, where modern agricultural methods had produced, in a single growing season, yields that exceeded anything the estate had achieved in living memory. The weaving manufactory, employing nearly 30 local workers and producing textiles now sought after by merchants across the Scottish lowlands. The gardens, even in their winter stillness, clearly the product of genuine and celebrated design that had already begun, Eleanor told him, attracting visitors curious to see what had been built at Ravensgate. William walked through all of it in a state of mounting and humbled astonishment, understanding with increasing completeness exactly what his mother's cruelty had in fact produced. Not the quiet disappearance of an inconvenient wife, but the emergence of a woman whose considerable capability had simply never before been given the room or the necessity to fully express itself. "You built all of this," he said, on the second evening, standing with her on the restored ramparts overlooking the winter sea, "in 10 months, out of a ruin." "I built it because I had nothing left to lose by trying," Eleanor said. "And because my father taught me, long before I ever met you, that despair is a luxury most people cannot actually afford, and that the antidote to it is very rarely comfort. It is work, purposeful, patient, practical work, that produces something real enough to stand against whatever tried to destroy you." She looked at him. "I did not build this to punish you, William. Whatever satisfaction I will admit I have occasionally taken in it, I built it because it was the only thing available to me that made the unbearable months survivable." William looked out at the dark winter sea, and then back at his wife, and understood, with a completeness that arrived slowly, but arrived entirely, exactly what he was asking her to give up if she agreed to return with him to Kilmarrow, and exactly what he would need to offer in exchange if he hoped for any chance of her genuinely agreeing. "I am not going to ask you to abandon this," he said. "Whatever you decide about coming back to Kilmarrow, whatever you decide about our marriage, Ravensgate is yours. It was always legally part of the Sinclair holdings, but what you have built here belongs entirely to you, and I will have that formally and permanently settled on you, regardless of what else we determine between us. You should never again be in a position where anyone can simply order you to disappear." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, and something in her carefully composed expression, for the first time since his arrival, genuinely softened. "That is the first thing you have said," she told him. "That sounds like the man I actually married, rather than the man my mother-in-law spent 2 years quietly constructing out of him." What followed was not a swift reconciliation, because Eleanor Ashby, who had, in 10 extraordinary months, become a woman considerably less inclined towards swift accommodations of any kind, was not going to permit it to be one. She required, before agreeing to anything resembling a full return to the marriage, a period of careful and honest rebuilding, conducted largely through correspondence and increasingly frequent visits, during which William was required to demonstrate, through consistent and sustained action rather than mere apology, that he had genuinely become capable of the kind of clear-eyed and independent judgment that would prevent any future version of his mother's cruelty from ever again taking such complete hold of him. She maintained Ravensgate throughout this period and continued to build it, and the enterprise that had begun as an act of survival grew, over the following years, into one of the most celebrated and genuinely prosperous estates in the Scottish borders. Its textiles known throughout the lowlands, its gardens visited by admirers from as far away as Edinburgh, its agricultural methods studied and imitated by neighbouring landowners, eager to replicate the Duchess's remarkable success. William, for his part, spent those same years earning back, patiently and completely, the trust his mother's poison had cost him, learning, in the process, to bring to his marriage, and to every other significant relationship in his life, the kind of direct and independent attention he had failed to bring in the earlier years of his marriage, no longer willing to allow anyone else's account of a person to substitute for his own careful and honest observation. When Eleanor finally agreed, 2 years after her banishment, to a full reconciliation, she did so on terms entirely her own devising, dividing her time between Kilmarrow Hall and Ravensgate Castle, maintaining full and independent control over the enterprise she had built, and requiring, as a permanent condition of the marriage's restoration, that Constance never again be permitted any position of influence within either household, a condition William had, by that point, already imposed upon his mother without needing Eleanor to demand it. Constance lived out her remaining years at a distant property, her ambitions for the Fairweather alliance permanently abandoned, her influence over her son's household entirely and irrevocably ended. She never fully acknowledged the completeness of the damage she had caused, and Eleanor, in time, found she had little interest in whether such acknowledgement ever came. She had built, from the wreckage of Constance's cruelty, something far too significant and far too genuinely her own to remain preoccupied with whether the woman who had tried to destroy her ever properly understood what she had failed to accomplish. Eleanor and William's second child, a daughter born in 1816, was raised between two homes: Kilmarrow Hall, restored under William's careful and finally genuine stewardship, and Ravensgate Castle, which remained, for the whole of Eleanor's life, the place she considered most truly and completely her own, the ruin she had been sent to disappear into, and had instead transformed, through nothing but her own patient and considerable will, into a kingdom that answered to no one but herself. And so ends tonight's tale. He banished her to a ruined castle. She turned it into a kingdom. A story about a mother's ambition so complete, she was willing to destroy her own son's marriage and grandchild to serve it, and a son who nearly lost everything by trusting her patient poison over his wife's desperate truth. A story about a woman sent away to disappear, who discovered, in the ruins of her exile, a strength and a capability that had simply never before been given room to exist, and who built, from nothing but will and patience and her father's hard-won practical wisdom, an entire kingdom that belonged completely to herself. A story about the particular and devastating cost of choosing a trusted lie over an inconvenient truth, and about what it takes, once the lie is finally exposed, to earn back a trust that was never simply given away, but was, in fact, deliberately and irreparably broken. And now, our question for you tonight, the one we want you to answer in the comments below. If you were Eleanor, if you had been banished to a ruin with nothing, and had built from that ruin an entire kingdom of your own making, would you have gone back when the truth finally came? Would you have set your own terms the way she did, or would you have kept the kingdom and let the marriage remain in the past where it nearly destroyed you? Tell me what you would do if it were you in that story. We read every single comment, and we love hearing from you more than you know. If tonight's tale moved you, please give this video a like and subscribe to Tales of Whispering Hearts so you never miss a new story. Share this with someone who has ever been sent away to disappear and needs to be reminded that a ruin is very often simply a kingdom waiting for the right person to build it. Until next time, may you never mistake exile for defeat, and may you always find, in the ruins of what was taken from you, the foundation of something entirely your own. This has been Tales of Whispering Hearts.